Okay, thank you very much for the presentation and also for the invitation. Even if, unfortunately, I won't be able to bring fieldwork data, but my paper will be general analysis and presentation of the relationship between mobility, pandemic, mobility restrictions, and also human rights. It's the news of today that Michelle Bachelet, who is commissioner for the human rights, responsible for the human rights at the United Nations, said that the COVID pandemic has been an opportunity for power for many governments and powers in different countries of the world to violate the human rights, and the violations of human rights have multiplied over the last year. So my presentation is divided in 3 parts, let's say. One, it's looking at the past and what are the information that we can have from the past about our present, because we always have to look at the past to understand the present somehow. And then there is a part about the issue between mobility and globalization. And then the first part is more looking at some specific examples in the borders management, end of mobility, and also in connection with the migration and in connection with the internal lockdowns, and then some possible conclusions at the end. So first of all, looking at the past, mobility and pandemic have a long, complex relationships, in the sense that the first one, the mobility, has been often at the origin of the different pandemics, starting from what is called the Great Death or the Great Plague of 1348, which is said that was brought by some Genovese ships coming from Crimea and the town of Kafka, and then it spread all over Europe, provoking minimum, we'd say 100 million deaths, probably to 200 million all over the world at the time, and killing about half of the population of Europe at the time. And then we know very well what happened in Mexico and in all America when the Europeans arrived there, and the indigenous population didn't have the immune system prepared to the new bacteria. And so almost 80% of the population of the new continent, the new for the Europeans, disappeared because of the different plagues, which was probably flu, different type of viruses, etc. As for the plagues in the 17th century, which were also very complex, that had provoked many deaths. In some cases, in some towns, 50% of the population, in others, 25% or 40%. There again, well, there was some climate change. It was a colder period, but also it was linked to the mobility of the soldiers during the wars that took place in Europe at the time. And the Spanish flu was also so devastating because there was this mobility of the soldier, the American soldiers who arrived in Europe during World War I. And it is also interesting that the plagues brought all the time restriction to mobility and closing of the border. That was a way to fight the pandemic. But at the same time, mobility was never completely blocked because, of course, it was necessary food supplies for the isolated cities. That was always necessary. But what is also interesting, if we look especially to the history of the Republic of Venice, which was a city that lived on trade, and that there was always a compromise between the mobility that had to be left and the economic situation. I mean, this very rigid idea that economy is not important, and it was never existed, even in the past, and even with plagues that provoked, as I said, around 50% of the deaths in a population. And precisely the Republic of Venice managed very well this compromise. They created a quarantine for the ships who could not enter for 40 days, and they had to stay in the islands, and they created places where it was possible to isolate people who were sick and also their members of their family, but business had to go on. And it's also extremely interesting to notice that it is true that normally in the plagues it was the poorest, the one who died most. But in the case of the Republic of Venice, it was very often the upper class, the big families who continued to do business, trade, and take care of the needs of the Republic, not to destroy the social fabric of the Republic. I mean, that was very clear. And it is interesting that during the plagues, very often, it was really the big families, the big patrician families who had the highest number of deaths. So it is interesting to see this type of compromises that were done to the restriction of mobility. And this is one first point, that, I mean, mobility can be restricted, but compromises have to be done to save this, let's say, the economy, but it's not only the economy, it's also the social fabric. In the case of Venice, it was really the social fabric of the Republic that had to be preserved. And it was the town that had probably the most efficient, that developed the most efficient system to face pandemics. So you develop a very efficient system to face pandemic when your first goal is to preserve the social fabric. That's, let's say, it's the first lesson that, looking a little bit at the history of the different pandemics, I found. And when the social fabric doesn't work, it's collapsing. When you have an authoritarian regime, as it was in the case of Milan during the same plagues, 1630, then it's a catastrophe from every point of view, no matter what type of restriction you introduce. And then also this horrible phenomenon which appeared in all the plagues, which is finding a scapegoat, and this historical scapegoatism, which very often were the minorities, the foreigners, the Jews. It was much worse in the places like Milan, for example, or other places with authoritarian regimes. And in Venice, the Jews were never accused of being responsible of the plagues, because there was a rational organization by the Republic. And of course, in other areas, there were pogroms against the Jews, and the authorities pushed toward the scapegoating. This is something we have to be in mind. So in a sense, it is, as the pandemics show, what are contradictions that already exist in the countries. Well, then today, past and present, is the COVID-19 the end of globalization. That's, I mean, a lot of things have been written about this. Globalization, it's enough a virus. Well, in a sense, it is really astonishing how very quickly the mobility, which was considered a part of globalization, and not only migration, but business travel, global tourism, etc., has been completely stopped. And but at the same time, the discourses of the politician, etc., have proposed another globalization. So from mobility globalization, which has been stopped, and really there is an issue there that on which I will go back. Why so little has been done to preserve mobility? For example, putting much more effort to create quick tests so that the people can go to the airport and have a quick test in half an hour and then take the plane, as now finally after 1 year they start to do, but it took a huge long time to develop tests that are quicker and that are more reliable and that can be done by the person themselves. A lot of money has been spent to develop, 35 vaccines or 20 vaccines, and nothing to have a testing system for the people, considering also that for the majority of the people who are under 50, COVID is no danger at all. So with the test, mobility could have been preserved, but that has not been done. And on the contrary, there has been an encouragement, we are victims of this, to make another type of globalization, which is the virtual globalization. So we have been pushed toward this virtual globalization, work from home, and the universities have been devastated by this idea of virtual. And but globalization has to go on, but in this virtual way. And of course, the televisions, but mainly internet, Netflix, etc., have taken a huge importance, while the physical mobility has been destroyed, and nothing has been done to make it easier. Well, there too, of course, this can work for some academics who like to stay at home, but I think it will be difficult to convince the African that virtual globalization is enough. So Africans want to come to Europe because they want to live in Europe. They are not interested to see Europe through the web, but they do it already. So this won't certainly stop migrations, and apparently, because we don't have much information, we don't know what's going on in Agadez, etc., but we know that every day people are dying to reach the Canary Islands. So this virtual globalization doesn't work in respect of migration. Then there have been the closing the borders, and that too, this closing the borders, which happened already March, February, etc., this was a very interesting and paradoxical phenomenon, because which contradicts with the connected world that we have. For example, let's say the countries that are considered to be very successful in the fight against the virus. New Zealand is considered to be a success. Okay. And Australia, we will see what type of success it is in respect to human rights, but let's say. Then, of course, Vietnam and Thailand, they are not migration countries, but New Zealand and Australia are. They receive migrants, they receive refugees. Well, they stopped completely immigration. All the people who had already obtained the visa to settle in New Zealand and Australia, they have been stopped. And it's not clear when all the previous migrants will be, the previous ones that had been accepted as migrants, will be accepted. The case, for example, for Canada. So countries that were immigration countries for people who had applied, paid, they are stopped. And for example, New Zealand, Australia, okay, they are islands. They are following this goal, which is 0 cases. What does it mean, 0 cases in a connected world, unless you keep this system of completely closing borders for a long time, for a very long time? It is absolutely impossible. Or you have to quarantine everybody who enters, as they do. In fact, now everybody who enters those countries has to quarantine in a hotel, closed in a room for 2 weeks. And it is not clear when this system will be able to finish, because the vaccination is a long process, as we know. So it is with this goal, which is 0 cases, we don't want any case, which is a little bit the goal that China is also doing. But China is a continent, as we know, with 1 million and 500,000 people, and China has closed only some provinces, and closes the provinces, never close the country as such. So this is a very interesting aspect also to see those countries who perceive this goal 0 cases and are ready to be closed to migrants, to tourism, to everything, for it's not clear for how long. Then an interesting case is also the US. I mean, the US, they were opposing migration since, Donald Trump has done part of his elections discourse when he was elected, reducing migration from Mexico with the idea of the wall, and also opposing the entrance of the people coming from Muslim countries. So immediately he stopped the travel to the United States, but it is, they're contradictory in a sense, but it is interesting that on the other side, he did not impose any internal lockdown, as did New Zealand, Australia, and then we see part of Europe. So it was possible to circulate freely, and it was just the external border that were closed. And this is relatively coherent with these anti-immigrant politics that Donald Trump had supported. But now we don't know what the Democrats will do. What will they do? Migration was very important flow towards the United States, coming from countries that have also huge human rights problems, let's say Honduras, for example, in a sense, even Nicaragua. Central America is a very dangerous place. There are people who are trying to get to the United States, and that some of them could be refugees. So at the moment, the politics of the Democrats are not clear at all in respect to this, because they are very in favor of the lockdown. So it is very difficult when you impose, will be also the same problem in Europe, when you impose a lockdown and no mobility for the people in a city, it is very difficult to say, well, at the same time we receive people from external. You have minimum to organize a quarantine system, which they are not talking about. So, it's very promising, all the discourse about racial equality that the Democrats are doing, but nothing is clear about how they are doing, what they are doing with the new migrants who will certainly try to come, especially with the impoverishment of Central America because of the pandemic. Are they planning to give the vaccine to all new migrants or refugees free, which would be a human right idea, but at the moment nobody has spoken about this. It is not even clear how much those vaccines will be paid, because finally it's really the new golden mine for the companies, the vaccine business. So here we have a lot of contradictions in respect to this issue of mobility, human rights, refugees, acceptation of new migrants in the future, etc. And these same contradictions that we find in the US, of course, we find them in Europe at an even larger sense. Europe, of course, they are going from one lockdown to the other, internal lockdown, where they reduce the mobility to ridiculous 1 kilometer, 10 kilometers, 5 kilometers. The French Absurdistan, the French case, as the Spiegel has defined them. Italy also, you can go to see your father if he's 90 years old, but you can't if he's 60, and if he's well, and maybe, completely Absurdistan in this reorganization. And it would really be interesting to be able to resuscitate somebody from the Republic of Venice to help those people to find some reasonable measures. But then the borders, what about the borders between states? Well, that was the beginning. They started to do this, the Italian were always very contradictory about this. It was, but business travel were allowed. If you just stay 3 days, you could come and go, but just 3 days for business travel, you could stay. But then the borders were closed, so no tourists, but business travelers, I mean, something, again, Absurdistan. But at a certain point, France and Germany, and especially France, by the way, in that case, they thought that Schengen was something that if you don't, what is left of Europe, if you don't have Schengen, already Europe has a lot of problems and crises. So if you even destroy the free internal mobility, so the free internal mobility had to be somehow preserved. And so, in fact, this Schengen mobility has been somehow allowed with a lot of difficulties among the states, among the different European states. But of course, the external borders are closed, which of course excludes all the migrants. Or the politics in front of the migrants is, well, trying not to talk about it. I would say that that's the strategy of the European countries, trying business as usual as they do to kick them back if they try to get to France, to kick them back to Italy, etc. But the only country where there has been a contradictory discourse is Italy. Italy is interesting because the present government is a government center-left, but who was there to stop the far-right policy of Salvini, which was really characterized of not allowing the migrants to come. For months and months, the left had asked to open the harbors that Salvini wanted to close to the migrants. So from one side, this government feels a sort of political duty, together with, of course, a moral duty, but I mean, moral is not so common among the politicians in these days, but the moral duty to open the borders. But of course, in the pandemic, this is very complex because you don't allow, for example, Americans to come, or you don't allow Russians to come for tourism, but you allow migrants, and we know that not all of them can apply for refugee status. So it's a little bit contradictory, but also there is this problems of the quarantine. And the quarantines for the migrants who arrive, they cost a lot of money. So in a situation of crisis, when you have a lockdown and people cannot move, to pay for the quarantines of the migrant gives arguments to the right and creates a lot of contradictions. So this is the present situation. They try to avoid that NGO boats go in sea to save the migrants. But at the same time, what is happening in Libya, the situation has certainly not improved. And so before, everybody, I mean, the mainstream newspapers were talking about this situation. Now nobody talks, but the migrants are certainly continue to be there in the camps. And nobody's taking care of this issue, which is a huge human rights issue. But again, with the strict lockdown that have been imposed, it is extremely complex to make a discourse about the border. So how can we allow the mobility of the migrants and the refugees, the people who have rights? How can the politicians, I mean, not when the people inside are in the lockdowns and they cannot even go to see their parents or their family. This is a really, really complex issue. And of course, this extremely complex issue is made even more complex by the fact that all the investment in research, money, etc., has been done on the vaccines. And so that apparently the vaccines are the only way to get out of this mess. And so you are supposed, the day when you open the borders, what, are you going to vaccinate all the people or the refugees who are coming? I mean, it's really something that is completely insane. Instead of investing all what could be invested also in finding a treatment. I mean, COVID is not the plague. It doesn't threaten the death of 50% of the population of a country. So this, instead of investing in treatment and developing medicine and also a testing way, the development has been the vaccine, and with the competition between companies, who is going to pay for the vaccine, for the refugees and for the potential refugees? Who is going to do vaccination campaign in Libya or in the camps? I mean, even in our cities, the migrants who are in the streets, for example, who are trying to go from France, there are many migrants who don't have a place where to stay. They sleep in the street trying to get to England. Nobody is really taking care of them. So we are really in front of violations of human rights. And what we have seen in our developed world, it's a sort of management of this crisis that is completely chaotic and doesn't establish priorities, nothing. The only priority just to save the system so that you don't have too many people who get to the hospital in intensive care without a broad vision in which you take into account what was also the mobility and what will be the mobility. Everybody's telling us that there will be a crisis, that the developing countries, the poor countries will pay the high price about this, and nobody's taking care of this issue in respect to how the mobility, also in respect to migration and to refugee, will have to be restored in this mess if the vaccines are the only way out of it. Personally, I think that there were many other types of way out, but for reasons that will be analyzed, everything has been put on the vaccine and the companies that have developed all these vaccines. And so what will happen to the people who are outside the developed world? I mean, probably China will somehow, China, India, Brazil will probably develop a very cheap vaccine that will be given to all the poor countries, and this will somehow solve the system. But then again, if it is like this, and it will probably be like this, I think that the management of this crisis, especially by the Western, has shown that the Western countries, Europe, the US, etc., are really at the end, at the bottom line of their capacity of political intelligence in the sense of brain. And with this, I'm finished.